Augustine against the Academy. Truth and Wisdom in the Contra Academicos. In this presentation, I'm going to cover some of the insights in St. Augustine's book, Against the Academicians. I wanted to make this presentation because I think St. Augustine is one of the greatest minds in Christian history, and his teachings on philosophy can guide us as Christians. In particular, I'd like to discuss what kinds of things we can know according to St. Augustine. Before I move on from this opening slide, I'd like to draw your attention to three things. First, the first word on this slide indicates my focus, St. Augustine's beliefs. I'm going to look at what he said about the following topic: can we know anything with certainty? I am focusing on St. Augustine's beliefs here, but keep in mind that there's no reason why you must agree with everything St. Augustine says here about philosophy. Some of this is just going to be his philosophical opinions. I think his opinions on this subject are very defensible, but not all of it is doctrine, and I want to make that clear. Second, I'd like to draw your attention to the phrase the Academy, up there in the white part. That's a reference to a group of philosophers called the Academicians. They were influential in St. Augustine's time, and he wanted to write a response to them. The Academicians believed in a philosophical position called Skepticism, which St. Augustine thought was dangerous. Academic skepticism said that we cannot really know anything with certainty, and St. Augustine's response tries to prove that there are some things we can know with certainty. So that's what you can expect in this presentation. It is an attempt to prove that there are some things we can know with certainty. Third, take a look at the two words truth and wisdom in the subtitle. All philosophy is about the pursuit of truth and wisdom. St. Augustine was a philosopher. He thought philosophy could lead us to God, and this was one reason why he thought academic skepticism was dangerous. The position that we cannot know anything with certainty includes a side effect. If we cannot know anything with certainty, then we cannot know truth and wisdom with certainty. It makes all of philosophy uncertain, including philosophical arguments for God and Christianity. Okay, now let's move on to the next slide. Introduction. I'm basing this presentation on the book in the title, Against the Academicians by St. Augustine. This book might be the very one he is writing in the painting on this slide. As part of my presentation, I will first cover why this book is different from other books about philosophy. Secondly, I will give 6 of St. Augustine's proofs that we can know some things with certainty. And then, thirdly, I'll reply to a few important criticisms of the book. On this slide, I've included a painting of St. Augustine by Caravaggio, a Catholic painter from the 1600s. I've mentioned that I think St. Augustine is one of the greatest minds in Christian history. Against the Academicians is an early example of his genius. He wrote it in 386 AD, the same year he converted to Catholicism. He actually mentions his conversion in the book, in the final chapter, saying, "I have renounced everything else that men regard as good, and have proposed to dedicate myself to the search for wisdom. And I am resolved in nothing whatever to depart from the authority of Christ, for I do not find a stronger." That's page 151 in the edition I cited in my bibliography, which you can find in the video description. St. Augustine wrote this book as part of his decision to convert to Catholicism, because he felt he needed to overcome the arguments of the academic skeptics, who said that we cannot know truth with certainty. It makes no sense to convert to a religion unless you first believe that you can know the truth and that this religion has it. St. Augustine says, "I no longer think that truth cannot be found by man. The arguments of the academics seriously held me back, but now I feel that in this book I have protected myself sufficiently against them." Pages 149 to 150. My hope is that you, my dear viewer, will also come away with the belief that truth can be found, and join St. Augustine in the philosophical pursuit of truth and wisdom in the Catholic Church. Now let's get to it. First off, what makes this book different from other books about philosophy? Well, there are several items. One is that it is written as a dialogue. Dialogue is not just when you're speaking to another person. It's also a style of literature, which tries to capture a conversation between two or more people and teach something valuable through that conversation. Why do some philosophers write this way? Because they think it adds interest. Philosophy is sometimes kind of dry. As philosophers, we don't want our writings to be dry. People can pay attention better if there are characters and a bit of back and forth. It also reflects Roman culture. Many famous philosophical writings of the time were written as dialogues, especially the writings of the philosopher Plato. Plato's dialogues about philosophy were part of Roman philosophy because Roman philosophers liked to read Plato's dialogues and learn from them, even though Plato himself was not a Roman. St. Augustine's book is within this tradition, and attempts to use it to help spread Catholicism among Roman philosophers. Jeffrey Ringer, a professor at the University of Tennessee, notes that St. Augustine lived in a pre-modern age when Christianity was in the ascendant. It was a Roman culture, and although a lot of the people had become Catholic, a lot of the philosophers and academics were still pagan. St. Augustine used the dialogue format because it was of interest, it had cultural transfer, and non-Catholics might actually pick it up and see what the Catholics were saying. And it worked. More and more of the philosophers from this time period were Catholics, and St. Augustine's book is an example of how academia was being transformed. Augustine himself was a former non-Catholic teacher in academia. He taught rhetoric, but became a Catholic and helped spread that faith among his contemporaries. This dialogue is not just a dialogue between himself and the characters in his book. It is, on another level, a dialogue with the non-Catholic intelligentsia of his time, and an attempt to give them reasons why they could embrace truth. Hopefully, as he himself did, Catholic truth. Conversion. That leads me right to my next point. St. Augustine's book was not just implicitly hoping that people would convert as a result of reading it. It was an explicit appeal for conversion as well, in the person of a man named Romanianus. Romanianus was a real person, the father of one of St. Augustine's students, at a school where Augustine taught rhetoric. He was also really not a Catholic, and St. Augustine wrote against the academicians to Romanianus, telling him in the introduction that he hoped that by reading it, Romanianus would convert. By our prayers, we hope to win for you the favor of God, that he may bring you back to your true self. It is also noteworthy to me that the name Romanianus is basically just Latin for Roman man. Perhaps St. Augustine hoped that by appealing to this particular Roman man, his book would be a direct appeal to all other Roman men, the other Romanianuses, the people of the empire. But beyond this, I think this conversion angle is one thing that makes this book of philosophy different from other books. It reveals its missionary heart. When we're reading St. Augustine, we're not dealing with philosophy just as a simple textbook, although I imagine this book could probably be used as one. It's not simply here to impart knowledge. It aspires to something even greater, salvation. To me, that's what all philosophy should be about. Philosophy has a higher purpose than just thinking deep thoughts. Philosophy is meant to draw us closer to God. St. Augustine's book is different from your average philosophical textbook because your average philosophical textbook isn't designed to save your soul. It just wants to give you facts. St. Augustine wants to give you faith as well. Think for a moment about whether this idea appeals to you. By reading St. Augustine's book, you have an opportunity to learn about philosophy in a context where its missionary purpose is front and center. This can help us as Christians see why philosophy is important. It doesn't have to be just dry and heady stuff, though I grant that some of it can be dry and heady. Philosophy can and has converted people to God. St. Augustine remarks that, if you let him, God will likewise bring you back to his people and allow your mind, which for so long has yearned for rest, to emerge at length into the fresh air of true freedom. Page 35. To me, that purpose makes this book different from other, less personal books of philosophy, and it's one reason why I think you might like it too. Happiness. Another thing that makes St. Augustine's book different is its roots in happiness. This takes a bit of explanation. The first book in this book is called Truth and Happiness. This is because St. Augustine believes there is a fundamental connection between the two. In some of the first lines of his dialogue, he has his own character, Augustine, ask a character named Licentius a question. If we can be happy without knowing truth, would you still think that the knowledge of truth is necessary? If you're like me, that question might strike you as a little unusual. But let's unpack it a little bit, because its answer is fundamental for why St. Augustine cared about philosophy. Do you like to know the truth? Probably you do, at least usually. Nobody likes to be lied to, for example. It usually hurts if we find out. I like to know the truth, at least when the alternative is believing a lie. I like to know the truth because lies hurt, and also because I don't like being ignorant. I want to be in the know. It's at this point that St. Augustine's question comes in. Would you seek the truth if you thought truth didn't make you happy? For St. Augustine, ultimately, everything we do because we think it will make us happy. And the point of his question is to help us realize that truth is part of being happy. Truth and joy go together. You and I both want to know the truth. How does St. Augustine know this? Because for most of us, being lied to or being ignorant is not appealing. That means we are more happy when we know the truth than when we don't. And that is also another thing that makes St. Augustine's book unique. His quest for philosophical truth and certainty is, at its root, a quest for happiness. It's a step in the direction of Christian joy. A.W. Strouse, a professor at the City University of New York, remarks that Augustine's book is remarkably a turn away from cold professionalism and toward a life of the passions. If you want philosophy to be cold and professional, pick up a different book of philosophy. St. Augustine's is about the way philosophy connects with the things we love most: happiness, relationships, becoming a better person, and especially finding the truth. Religious truth. St. Augustine's book is a step toward finding religious truth. In the Catholic tradition, God's word is more certain than any human reasoning. Philosophy can lead us to that word, and in that way, it can actually lead us beyond itself. Philosophy can take us right up to the door of faith, but it can't cross over. It can teach us that there is a trustworthy God, but it can't make us trust him. Nonetheless, bringing us to that point is a good thing. Thus, in St. Augustine's mind, before he could come to know religious truth, he had to believe that it was possible to know any kind of truth. Galena Hashhozheva, a tutor at Harvard University, writes that Augustine denounced skepticism and fortified his new religious creed against the forces of doubt and uncertainty. This also makes the book very relevant in our times. Today, there are forces of skepticism who deny that it is possible to know any truth, and there are forces of relativism who deny that there is such a thing as truth. St. Augustine's book can be helpful in any dialogue you may have with agnostics, relativists, skeptics, scientifically minded atheists, or anyone who places no confidence in philosophy. I know I've had conversations with people who think philosophy is pretty much worthless and cannot give us truth. I think this book is worthwhile to share with them, and I hope that you'll read it and see if you agree. The forces of doubt and uncertainty today need a kind of proof that there are things we can know, and that's what St. Augustine provides us with. His book is thus not only interesting, it is extremely practical. It gives you powerful tools for convincing people who don't believe in truth or certainty that truth is real and that there are some things we can be certain of. This is very useful for a religious apologist. It was certainly useful for St. Augustine. When he didn't believe certainty was possible in this life, he was unable to be certain that Catholicism was true. But once he overcame the arguments of the academic skeptics, he realized that the way was now clear. He could believe in things, he could accept Catholicism, and be baptized. If you are at all interested in defending the claims of Christianity from people who say that we can't really know anything, pick up a copy of Against the Academicians. He'll show you that we can. Political truth. Another thing that makes St. Augustine's book different is that it is an early precursor of his political thoughts, which he would expand in greater detail in a later book, The City of God. Michael Foley, a professor of philosophy at Marywood University, writes that Augustine's most impassioned condemnation of academic skepticism is about the impact of skeptical thought on public life. There's a bit more to this story, actually. Against the Academicians isn't a political book, but it does mention the negative impact that skepticism can have on politics. If we don't believe that we can know anything with certainty, how can a trial ever go forward? If somebody gets tried for mass murder, and all the evidence is considered, the jury is supposed to say, "We find you guilty, but only maybe? We sentence you to death, but we're not certain?" Politics requires that we be really sure of our principles before we make political decisions. Moreover, St. Augustine points out, if a lawyer's client ever gets sentenced to death, under the banner of academic skepticism, the lawyer could point out that the man on trial can't even be sure he is on trial. Nothing is certain, so even our being here in court is uncertain, not to mention the evidence used to convict the man. Skepticism thus destroys our ability to make reasonable political decisions, and Augustine used this as one of his arguments against it. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why St. Augustine's book is different. It is a philosophical dialogue, it is aimed at converting hearts to God, it helps us find happiness through truth, it clears the way for religious faith, and it upholds our ability to know political truths. This is a very important book. And now that we know some of the ways that this book is different from other philosophical books, let's take a look at some of St. Augustine's proofs that there are some things we can know with certainty. First up is the argument from disjunctives. A disjunctive is when you set up an either-or distinction. It's often used in logic as part of a type of argument called the reduction to absurdity. Essentially, if you have to choose between only two options, and there is a good reason why only two options are available, then one of them must be true. If option A leads to something absurd, option B must be true. In this case, St. Augustine shows that academic skepticism reduces to absurdity. Here's his argument. I shall employ the safest disjunction. Skepticism must be either true or not true. If it is true, then I am in sound possession of it. If it is not true, then something can be perceived. That's a bit wordy, so let's unpack it a bit. Skepticism must be either true or not true. That's the disjunctive at issue here. In this case, there are no other options, because true and besides true and not true. This is because the one is the negation of the other. If you've ever taken a course in logic, you'll recognize what St. Augustine is doing here. Between any statement and its negation, one of them must be true. It's a certainty. A disjunctive argument guarantees that we can find truth. All you've got to do is say, I believe that skepticism is true or untrue. That's certainly a true statement because it embodies a disjunctive where one of the options must be true. There's something deeper here, however. Let's do an experiment and ask an imaginary person, Sammy Skeptic, the following question. Hey, Sammy Skeptic, is skepticism true? Sammy sits down and thinks for a minute. Since it's a true disjunctive, yes or no are the only options. That's not just an arbitrary rule, it's a law of logic. Between any statement and its negation, one of them must be true. After thinking, suppose Sammy Skeptic stands up and says, yes, skepticism is true. He is a skeptic because he believes in skepticism. At this point, you've caught him. Skepticism says he can't know truth. But if skepticism is true, then he knows a truth. Okay, so that option, as a skeptic, is blocked to him. So suppose he says, no, skepticism is not true. Then you've got him that way as well. Skepticism says we cannot know truth, but skepticism is not true. Therefore we can know truth. Either way, we can know something true. One simple disjunctive has proven that truth is attainable, and that skepticism is self-contradictory. It reduces to absurdity. This is one of the most impressive moments in Augustine's book. Against the Academicians is supposed to be a response to academic skepticism, and in just one argument, Augustine overthrows the Academy. But he's got a lot more firepower, so let's keep going. Mathematics. St. Augustine says, no matter in what condition I am, if there is one world and 6 worlds, there are in all 7 worlds, and I unhesitatingly assert that I know this. The fundamental point here is simple, but there are a few unusual concepts thrown in, so let's unpack it a bit. No matter in what condition I am. What's that mean? Well, the skeptics of St. Augustine's day tried to prove that you couldn't trust your own eyes, because if you're dreaming, you'll think you're seeing things that you really aren't. They concluded that we can never know anything for certain, because we can't always know for certain if we're dreaming or not. Part of St. Augustine's reply was that there are some things we can know even if we are dreaming. We can know that 6 and 1 make 7, for example. The condition in no matter in what condition I am is awake or asleep. No matter if you're awake or asleep, you can know math. He also gives another example of mathematical knowledge. 3 times 3 makes 9. This must be true even though the human race were snoring. His point here is that the truth of mathematics does not depend on whether you're awake or not. Math is objective, and it is available to us even if we were all asleep. The skeptic's point was that we can never know if we're dreaming. St. Augustine points out that even if you couldn't know if you were dreaming or not, you can know some things, math included. I also wanted to mention the unique way that St. Augustine uses math here. Normally, in everyday life, math is in use all around you in ways you might not expect. The beams of the frame of the house you're in were precisely measured with mathematical machines so that your house would be stable. The computer you are watching this video on has fine-tuned mechanics that operate on mathematical principles. This is the way scientists use math. They use it to precisely measure the effects of changes they make in the world, so that our technology can reliably do what we want it to. I tell you that to tell you this. Math has another purpose. Math is meant to glorify its creator, and all the beautiful and intricate things we do with it are actually a testament to the skill and cleverness of the God who made all numbers. Math is God's, and in these passages, St. Augustine is giving it back to him, using math to show us that knowledge is possible, truth is real, skepticism is false, and that is just a tiny extra piece of evidence that some other worldview, Catholicism maybe, is the true one. In Christ, God calls us to sanctify all things. In these couple of passages, St. Augustine takes this to its depths. He sanctifies the multiplication tables. He uses them to teach us something about truth, as part of a path that leads toward God. Logical facts. Logical facts are another one of St. Augustine's proofs of things we can know. St. Augustine says, "I know more about logic than about any other part of philosophy. The same soul cannot both die and be immortal. A man cannot at the same time be happy and not happy. What I seem to see is either body or not body. These and many other things are true in themselves, no matter what state our senses are in." These are all examples of logical facts, things that must be true by reason of logic itself. Now, as a perceptive viewer, you may have noticed that these are examples of disjunctives, and we saw disjunctives a while back in this video. These disjunctives are used a bit differently than the one we saw earlier, though. The disjunctive we saw earlier was an attempt to show that skepticism is self-contradictory, because when you launch the disjunctive true or not true at skepticism, a skeptic mustn't say skepticism is true, lest he confess that we can know something true, and he also mustn't say skepticism is not true, because that too would mean that we can know truth. These disjunctives aren't doing the same thing. There are many disjunctives. True or not true is the most basic one, but these examples are true disjunctives too. Mortal or not mortal, happy or not happy, body or not body. And the attempt here is to show that we can make statements out of these disjunctives that are logically certain and true. What I seem to see is either body or not body. Why? Because there aren't any other options. Suppose a skeptic said, "Ah, there is another option. What you think you are seeing is actually only a dream." Then you can ask him, well, is a dream a body? Whether he answers yes or no, he verifies your original statement. What we think we see is either a body or not a body. There are literally no other options, because everything is either a body or not a body. Thus, this statement is certainly true. What we seem to see is either body or not body. It's a brilliant proof by St. Augustine that absolutely demolishes the skeptical position by showing that we can know logical facts. It is also important to mention that disjunctives are not the only logical facts we can know. St. Augustine says, "All these facts and many others, which it is unnecessary to recall, logic has taught me, and certainly I must not be ungrateful." Page 133. The majority of the examples St. Augustine gives about logical facts are logical disjunctives, and I would have liked it if he had gave more logical facts than he did. But that's a personal taste. I think he could have also used logical facts like the law of identity. Everything is itself, and not something else. But what he gave us is sufficient to show that there are some things we can know, and that was his purpose. Appearances. Appearances are the things we think we see all around us. Skeptics argued that we can never be certain that we are seeing things, because we might only be dreaming, and even when we are awake, they said we can't be certain that our eyes are working right. They liked to give the example of a stick that sticks partly out of water. When you look at it from the side, the stick appears to be broken in the middle, and therefore, they said, our eyes can deceive us. St. Augustine's response was clever. A cause has intervened so that a stick in water should present itself as broken. Do not assent more than that you know that it appears broken to you. There is then no deception. I do not see how the academic can refute him who says, I know that this stick presents itself to me as broken. This response is clever for several reasons, but one of them is that it turns the academic's argument back on himself. The academic wants to show us that our eyes can be deceiving, and therefore can't be trusted. But St. Augustine shows that they can give us certainty anyway. We can be certain that our eyes seem to show us things. The stick in the water really does appear to be broken. We don't have to be certain that it is broken, just that our eyes make it look broken. This reply is also a good way to block the implications that the skeptic wants to draw from the fact that our eyes can deceive us. They want to use this to imply that our eyes can't be completely trusted, but they go too far in saying that they can't be trusted at all. St. Augustine takes a middle approach. Do not assent more than that you know the stick appears broken to you. He assents to his eyes partly, but not fully. He assents to the appearances that our eyes show us, but he doesn't claim that appearance is always reality. The skeptics thought that if you can't know what something looks like in reality, then you can't know anything at all. But St. Augustine said we can know something, how things appear. He also mentions that there are additional reasons to trust our eyes. Quote, Other philosophers may perhaps say many other things in defense of the senses, and I am not aware that the academics have said anything to refute them. Certainly their arguments against sense perception are not valid against all philosophers. End quote. Page 129. St. Augustine doesn't go into all the possible reasons why we can trust our senses, but he does say that they give us appearances, and we can be certain that they give us these. That's enough to show that we can know some things with certainty. If I am deceived, I am. The next two arguments come from one of St. Augustine's later books, The City of God. The City of God expanded on a lot of St. Augustine's early thoughts, including his thoughts about how to respond to the Academy. I think they belong in this presentation against the academicians, because the arguments I'm about to give are still explicitly in response to the academicians, and they are in continuity with his earlier book. Here's one of his responses to the academicians from The City of God. The academicians say, What if you are deceived? But if I am deceived, I am, for he who is not cannot be deceived. Book 11, Chapter 26. Now, beside this argument, I've put up a picture of a Catholic philosopher from the 1600s named René Descartes. René has a much more famous remark that is similar to what St. Augustine says in The City of God. René said, "I think, therefore I am." What he meant was that every person can be sure of at least one thing: you yourself exist. Even thinking about it is already an example of existing. Mr. Descartes is very famous for this argument, but in my opinion, St. Augustine beat him to the punch. The academic skeptics said that we cannot be certain of anything because we might be deceived every time we think we have proven something with certainty. But St. Augustine points out that you can always be sure you exist, even if you were somehow proven wrong about everything else, because you are the one being wrong. If you did not exist, you would not be wrong about anything, because you would not be anything. The very fact that you can be wrong about some stuff, deceived about some stuff, is positive proof that you exist. And therefore it's just another thing we can have certainty about. Since I've brought up René Descartes here, I want to make another comment about him. Jeremy Robbins, the head of school at the University of Edinburgh, calls one of St. Augustine's arguments fundamentally solipsistic. This is a common criticism leveled against Mr. Descartes as well. Solipsistic is a big word, though, so let's look at what it means. Solipsism is the belief that you are the only thing you can know with certainty in the whole world. If I made a statement that was fundamentally solipsistic, that would mean I know I am real, but I'm not sure that anything else is real. It's one step away from absolute skepticism, where you don't think you can know anything for sure, not even your own existence. St. Augustine did think you can know that you are real, but he also thought we can know other things are real, so, contrary to Jeremy Robbins, he was not a solipsist. Now, I'll talk more about this criticism in a few minutes, but I just want to point out here that this is another way that St. Augustine has been compared to René Descartes. The same criticism has been leveled against both René and St. Augustine for similar reasons. I know that I know. This is another argument against the academics that comes from St. Augustine's later book, The City of God. As I know that I am, so I know this also, that I know. Book 11, Chapter 26. This argument fits quite naturally as a cap on all his other arguments. It is a bit silly in one sense, but that mirrors the nonsensical nature of academic skepticism. The argument, I know that I know, only works after you've proven that you know something with certainty. So you first have to use one of the other arguments I've talked about, or an argument I haven't talked about, since I haven't been able to cover them all. But basically, after you've proven that you really do know one thing, for sure, you can instantly know a second thing. You can know that you know the first thing. Of course, this doesn't stop there. Suppose the first thing you know for sure comes from our first argument. You know for sure that skepticism isn't true, since it refutes itself. Well, congratulations, you know one thing for sure. But wait, if you know one thing for sure, then you can be sure of a second thing. The first thing you know is that skepticism is wrong, and the second thing you know is that you know skepticism is wrong. Now you can do the same thing again and tell your opponent that you know three things. You know that skepticism is wrong, you know that you know, and you know that you know that you know, and so forth, out to infinity. This kind of argument is called recursive. It operates on itself without breaking down. In one way, it is the opposite of a self-contradiction. A self-contradictory statement breaks down when applied to itself. A recursive statement still remains valid when applied to itself. And you might not think a recursive argument is very useful, but a computer scientist will tell you that computer programs use recursion all the time. Some computer programs need to generate really long numbers so that they can store long documents as a single, easily shared number. And in order to generate a really big number, they will take a small number and recursively multiply it by itself a certain number of times. They don't do it an infinite number of times, but after a few dozen runs, a recursive program can generate enormous numbers, which are very useful for computers, which store everything as numbers. So there you go. St. Augustine sanctified an obscure modern computational algorithm called recursion many years before computers existed, and used it to mirror the nonsensical nature of academic skepticism, and demonstrate that we can know the truth, sometimes with certainty. Now that we know some of the ways St. Augustine showed that we can have certainty, let's look at some of the criticisms of his book. Still skeptical? Laurent Cesalli and Nadja Germann are professors of philosophy in Europe. They wrote an article in 2008 that criticizes some of the arguments St. Augustine makes in his book. Their major criticism is that Augustine's certain truths still leave us in partial skepticism. His argument leads to a conception of truth as something that cannot be known by the senses, but only by reason. I also mentioned another criticism earlier in this presentation by a man named Jeremy Robbins. He said that St. Augustine's evaluation of appearances is fundamentally solipsistic. It leads to the view that I know I am real, but not that anything else is. There are several reasons why I personally think that these criticisms are incorrect, but one of them is that they seem to neglect some of St. Augustine's arguments. Cesalli and Germann say that Augustine thought we cannot know truth by means of our senses, but, as I showed earlier, he did think they could lead us to truth. The truth that the things we see appear to have certain visible characteristics. St. Augustine regarded this as a certain truth that comes from our senses. Plus, he mentioned that there were other arguments in defense of the senses that he didn't want to get into, since he had already shown that they can give us certainty at least about appearances. As for Mr. Robbins, some of St. Augustine's arguments demonstrate that things other than ourselves do exist. For example, the laws of logic and mathematics were facts that Augustine had access to through reason, and the existence of appearances of things outside himself are another example. For these reasons, I think these criticisms of St. Augustine miss their mark. He didn't leave us in skepticism, but showed us that we can have real certainty about some things. And he didn't leave us in solipsism, because he showed us that things other than ourselves certainly exist. In conclusion, overall, St. Augustine teaches us truth and wisdom to help us reach happiness. Moreover, a lot of his ideas for how we can attain certainty are relevant to modern times. Let's all use his ideas and not overlook his importance in philosophy. Thank you.